Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I would start. And at the time in filming this video, none of these guys have been placed on the COVID list or ruled out, because I know this thing's been spreading, and every few hours some new news comes out and more players are placed on the list. But anyway, the first guy is Greg the Legs Erline of the Dallas Cowboys. So this Cowboy offense has been struggling over the last few weeks here, and it's been beneficial here for Greg the Legs Erline to get more field goal opportunities instead of extra points. And we know he's got one of the best boots in all of pro football, even though he's not as good as he was a few seasons ago with the Los Angeles Rams. But the last few games here for Zerline: Week 13 at New Orleans, 11. Week 14 at Washington, 12. And then Week 15 at the Giants. If he didn't miss 2 extra points, he would add more fantasy points. But most leagues, it's -2 for missing them. So he only had 4 fantasy points. But this week here, Sunday Night Football, Cowboys at home, indoor game, obviously, which is always a plus for kickers or any fantasy player, a matter of fact. He's going to get opportunities, in my opinion, to at least get 7 to 10 fantasy points and bounce back. So he's a kicker I would start this week. The second guy I would start is Daniel Carlson, Vegas Raiders. So Daniel Carlson, he's been a pretty good kicker this season here for the Raiders, and he won the ball game the other night on Monday versus the Cleveland Browns. His time expired, a walk-off field goal to win the ball game. So Carlson, the last few games here for him has been a mixed bag of results. Week 13 versus Washington, 11. Week 14 versus the Kansas City Chiefs. In that one, he had 0 fantasy points because he missed an extra point. And then Week 15 at Cleveland with the game winner, 11 fantasy points. So right here, Week 16, they're at home, which is also good. He's a good kicker at home as well. Indoor ball game. And the Broncos give up the 12th least amount of fantasy points to kickers. But I still think this ball game, this Bronco defense will bend but don't break. But the Raiders will have a few opportunities in the red zone and have to settle. And like I mentioned, Carlson's one of the better kickers this season, and he's a kicker I would start. The next kicker is Ryan Suckup of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Suckup last week, he got shut out with 0 fantasy points. And this Tampa Bay Buccaneer team didn't score anything, 9-0. But this week, you better bet they're going to come out with a vengeance and try to put up a lot of points here at the Carolina Panthers that give up the 16th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right here, some reinforcements are on the way for Tom Brady, at least in the Buccaneers. Even though Leonard Fournette's out, Chris Godwin's out for the season, and Mike Evans, he'll probably be questionable or a game-time decision with that hamstring injury. But Antonio Brown will be back, and Le'Veon Bell they signed. We'll see if he plays any role in this ball game. But anyway, Ryan Suckup, he's not going to get shut out again here. This Buck team, like I mentioned, the games this season where they lost a tough ball game, they've bounced back for the most part and put up 30-plus points. And we saw it early in the year. They lost at the Washington football team, and then they bounced back the next few weeks here with 30, 38, 30, and 33. So right here at a weak Carolina team, I know a division rival, I think Brady and this Buck offense gets in the red zone early and often, and I think Suckup has a good ball game, and he's a kicker I would start this week. The next kicker is Young Hoku of the Atlanta Falcons. So Young Hoku, he hasn't been as good as he was last season, but for the most part, that hasn't been his fault here, Young Hoku. He could just kick as many as opportunities as he's going to get, but this week here, he's got the matchup as all matchups versus the Detroit Lions that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So the last few games here for Koo: Week 12 at Jacksonville, 3. Week 13 versus Tampa Bay, 4. Week 14 at Carolina, 12. And Week 15, still a decent ball game with 7 fantasy points. And right here, Week 16 versus Detroit, I think he has a good game. They give up the most fantasy points, and I could see this be a mini shootout between two struggling teams in this one here in Atlanta. So I think Young Hoku could get anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points, and he's a kicker I would start this week. And the fifth and final kicker is Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So Greg Joseph, it's been a good first season for him with the Minnesota Vikings this year. After bouncing around the league and practice squads over the last few seasons. The last few games here for Joseph: Week 13 at Detroit, 10 fantasy points. Week 14 versus Pittsburgh, 10. And then Week 15 at Chicago, 5. So right here, Week 16 versus the Rams, pretty decent matchup. They give up the 13th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And this Ram defense is a bend but don't break type of defense where they're going to hold most teams to field goals more than touchdowns. So right here, Joseph, we know he's got a big boot. This is an indoor game, which is always a plus for a kicker, like I mentioned. And I think Joseph here could have a good ball game, and he's a kicker to start. So that's a few kickers I would start here in Week 16 of the fantasy football season.